Welcome back, everybody, and welcome, Lauren. Thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Sally. It's good to be with you.
All right, so this is a pretty complicated topic, and I swear just about every phone call I have, it comes up, which is, should I submit my test scores? If I have them, I took them back in December, they weren't as good as I was hoping, or I've tried to take the SAT or the ACT 4 times and it's been canceled every time, or I was able to sign up, but it's 3 hours away and I'm going to have to rent a hotel room and my mom's going to have to come with me, et cetera, et cetera. Is it worth it? So lots of stuff going on there. And some of the time I have to say it depends. Some of the time I have to say definitely submit. Some of the time I have to say do not submit. So what are your, like, let's kind of like dig into it, maybe sort of like one scenario at a time. Like, how would you unpack this, Lauren?
Sure. Well, first of all, I agree that I think that this is probably the number one question we're getting. I think it's first and foremost very difficult for families and students to all of a sudden switch their mindset and think, well, what do you mean testing is all of a sudden not important? Or are they lying to us and say, the students that do submit it are going to have a better shot than the students that don't? So I think it's really hard to trust that when a school says that they are test optional, that you will get a fair review. But remember, all the other pieces of your application are going to be that much more important. So I think it really comes down to whether or not the student believes either their previous test score or potentially what their test score could be is going to be a real strength of their application. If you don't think it's going to be a strength, or you are very stressed out about this, or you haven't been prepping, remove it. Remove that burden from you and focus on the other pieces of your application. So first of all, I think that's my number one message is trust. When they say test optional, they really do mean it.
Yeah, I'm working with one student who I really want to have take the test if he can, because his grades are weaker and his practice tests are consistently like, in a range that would help him, right? Like the lower range of his practice test should be helpful for the colleges that he's looking at. So with him, I'm like, I know this might be a pain, but I want you to try and do it. But with other students, I mean, I would say actually in most cases, I'm actually telling students to stop worrying about it and just submit what they have. Is that what you're doing? Like no test scores, just transcript and everything else.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there are some students that it is worth it for them to take it. If they have invested a lot of time, energy, maybe money in prepping for this test, go and you have the opportunity to take it and take it safely. You feel comfortable with that, then go for it. But that it's not going to hurt you to take that test. Most schools then are still test optional. If you don't ultimately hit what you want, for most schools, you can still withhold it. So if you're prepping for it, you feel prepared and you think this is going to be a strength of your application, go for it. I think a lot of students I'm saying don't bother because either they prepped for it months and months ago and have just focused on other things. You're not going to magically walk into this test and knock it out of the park if you are out of test prep mode for months and months. These tests are not easy. They don't come naturally to most students. Even being in that timed setting is not natural. So you really need to evaluate where you are with test prep. So, I think that that's kind of my main advice here. I think the bigger question that we need to talk about is the situation of, I have a test score. Should I submit that one? Are you getting a lot of those cases too?
Oh yeah, I am. And it's really challenging for people to parse that out. It's and honestly, it's a little tough for us too, right? Like, I mean, if you look, for example, at the Ivies, their reported test scores go far lower, in all honesty, than I tell students to go ahead and report. Because I think what people don't realize is that the students who are scoring in kind of the lower half of that range are typically in special categories that are institutional priorities, like recruited athletes, where the standards are still high, but they're lower. So just because a student is sort of in the range doesn't necessarily mean they want to submit, but at another institution, maybe they do. So how do you help people parse that out, Lauren?
Well, I think that message right there, I would sum up what you just said as that it's not a choice of send everywhere or send nowhere. It really is. So if you have 10 schools on your list, you should have a sheet and you say send or not send, send or not send, because it could be a case by case situation. I don't think it's a one side, again, send everywhere or send nowhere. I don't think that that's really the choice you have to make. Maybe. So how do you figure that out? So I'm talking to student. Well, first of all, we don't know what this coming year is going to look like in terms of test averages, but we do know what last year looked like. So I still think it's important for students, again, make an Excel spreadsheet. I think the easiest place is to go to the College Board's Big Future site. So bigfuture.collegeboard.org. You put in the name of the college, you click on applying, and it will show you the range of SAT or ACT scores of admitted students from last year. My advice is if your test score falls in the middle or upper end of that published range, send it. If your test score is in the low end of the range or not in the range at all, don't send it. It's not going to help you. So that's what I would do one by one for your schools on your list.
Yeah, and that is the basic rule that I tell people too. I mean, if a school admits 80%, you probably could submit it if it was lower, but let's just be safe and say, yeah, middle of the range, right? Or higher. If you are in that range, the test score is going to be an asset to you in your application process. So I completely agree in that. The one other thing I would say though is that occasionally some colleges will actually post their test score averages on their website, like University of Illinois or Urbana-Champaign does this, I think, so it's worth it, I think, to take a quick look for it. But in general, Big Future is probably where you're going to find that data. I also ran into the other day when I was talking to a student, a college that only reported the SAT and not the ACT. And so my recommendation was go to a conversion chart and convert your scores and figure out. So just do that. Don't get stuck by that. And don't worry that, you're going to be in trouble because you didn't take the right test either. They'll take either. They just don't have enough data. So all right. Any other complications though? Like if a student is thinking about not going test optional about using the test optional thing and not submitting a test score, it's not just admission that comes into play. So, what are your thoughts there?
I think it's also important to note, and this is tedious research, but this is your job, school by school, you should know whether or not the school requires standardized testing for any merit scholarship consideration. So the admissions might be test optional, but they might say in order to qualify for a merit scholarship or certain scholarships, you must submit testing. So if that's important to you and might change your list or your practice of whether or not to take this test again, you should be informed of that. That might require some digging or even picking up the phone or emailing the admissions office directly, but that's something you should know now rather than down the road when you're too late.
Yeah, pick up the phone, call the admission office, use the chats that they have. You can even tweet at them these days, and you might be able to get an answer. So, but yeah, I think this is the research that a lot of families are hoping to avoid, but I just think this year is more complicated. And I also think with some places it's a moving target. Like, have you heard that whether University of Florida is still requiring test scores or not? I mean, they were sort of like a last holdout. I don't know if they are now, but.
And well, what I think is so interesting is that things are still not entirely set in stone with University of California system recently saying they were test optional, and now they are test blind or not going to consider testing at all. And it's not totally, we haven't even heard completely from the schools. That was a federal ruling. So this is just so interesting that things are still evolving and how it might impact years to come. I think the testing world, if testing, I think for a lot of students causes anxiety. If you are an underclassman, freshman, a sophomore, junior, this might be the silver lining
Mhm.
of COVID consequences that might really benefit you moving forward. That I have a feeling that a lot of test optional schools are going to remain that way.
Well, I think there was even it was inside higher ed or something. Somebody did a poll, and actually a lot of schools are planning that, which I think also should give students reassurance that they will be read fairly without the test scores, you know?
Absolutely. And I think if there's one clear message that sends, if you are hearing testing is not as important as you think it is, what you also need to be hearing is that grades are even more important than you think they are. So if you're an underclassman, nothing matters more than grades and your curriculum choices. So put the emphasis there for sure, because you have control over that.
Yeah, exactly. That is where you have the most control. So, yeah. And all right, what about submitting test scores? I mean, a lot of people think they need to send official scores, and the fact is, not all colleges require those now.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of colleges allow self-reported scores, and what that means is within the common application or the coalition application, there's a testing section that is optional to fill out. You can submit those applications without filling it out, but that's self-reporting. And if the college allows self-reported scores, you don't need to pay the $10 or $12, whatever it is, to send from the testing agency. You will ultimately have to validate it and send it if you're admitted and want to enroll. You have to then send the test scores eventually. So that's just another, if you want to save, $10 here and there, that can help. But on the flip side, just remember if that testing section on the Common App is not required to fill out. So if you want to leave that blank, that's okay. And then again, your school by school choice of do I send or do I not send, you can do that from the testing agency itself.
Well, and you can even modify the common application by school by school. I don't recommend that because I feel like there's so many opportunities for error for sending the wrong version to the wrong school. But if you're very careful, I do think that is an option sometimes.
Yeah.
Like I talk about that with APs for students where they can just self-report. I'm saying for public universities, typically a 3 is fine. For private schools, I recommend don't report unless it's a 4 or above, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Last sort of scenario that we didn't cover is if you haven't taken any tests and you have one scheduled for, let's say, October, you're hoping to take it, should you wait to apply for if a school's rolling admissions? And I think that one's really tricky. You kind of have to have a crystal ball here of what you're going to score. So at the very least, I would be saying, are you taking practice tests? Do you have an idea, a prediction of your test range? But typically, if it's rolling admissions, I still think students should get those applications in sooner rather than later, or meet the early action deadline. I think that as long as your grades and your essays are all in a great place, I think that's probably going to be a bigger advantage than having a test score. But one more thing to note is see if the college allows you to apply, send in your application, and then later update with testing. That is a school by school decision that you have to figure out their policies as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of bummed that not all colleges are allowing that. I mean, under the circumstances, you would think that they would, but anyway. All right. Well, I think we've covered everything. Any last thoughts, Lauren?
Just hang in there, guys.
Yeah, exactly. If it helps, the colleges are stressed out about all this too. I don't know if it does,
very I the tears that testing has never been fun, and wow, it continues to not be fun to navigate these.
But I think you're right. The one silver lining of all this is that if you are somebody who tests make you anxious and you're a younger student, 9th grade, 10th grade, you may end up it not being a big deal. It may end up being completely unnecessary for you. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Lauren.
Thanks, Sally.
All right, so we're going to be taking a short break, but when we get back, Ian and I will be discussing his coping with being denied from his first choice college. I don't know why I'm taking so much glee in talking about Ian being denied, but he's a colleague. We like to tease him. So, all right, take care, Lauren.